The forest was unnervingly still, its silence broken only by the occasional crackle of the campfire. Stars spread like spilled salt across the night sky, their brilliance overwhelming in the absence of city lights. Tom sat on a weathered log near the fire, nursing a cup of lukewarm coffee. He felt like an interloper in his own life, a man slowly fading into irrelevance. The weekend trip, pitched as a bonding adventure by his coworker, felt more like an elaborate distraction from the crumbling remnants of his marriage. Across the fire sat Sophia, her silhouette dancing in the firelight. She was talking animatedly about alien civilizations, her voice low and magnetic. It wasn't the kind of conversation Tom usually engaged in, but Sophia seemed to pull everyone into her orbit. She spoke with conviction, weaving tales of cosmic rituals and ancient star maps. The rest of the group chuckled or nodded politely, treating her stories as harmless eccentricities. Tom found her unsettlingly captivating. She wasn't conventionally beautiful. There was something sharp and otherworldly in her features, but her presence was impossible to ignore. Her gaze flicked to him occasionally, lingering a beat too long. "Tom," she said suddenly, drawing him into the conversation. "What do you think? Could we be more connected to the stars than we realize?" Caught off guard, he shifted uncomfortably. "I think people believe what they need to believe. The universe is too big not to feel a little lost in it." Sophia smiled, her eyes glinting in the firelight. "Exactly. That's why we search for meaning. Sometimes it's closer than we think." The fire popped, sending a shower of sparks into the dark. Tom looked away, unnerved by her intensity. The group dispersed after midnight, each retreating to their tents. Tom lingered near the embers, staring into the dying flames. He didn't feel like sleeping. His mind wandered to his wife, Claire. They had been together for 10 years, though the last 2 had felt more like a quiet truce than a marriage. She had stopped asking him about his day, and he had stopped trying to make her laugh. Trouble sleeping? Sophia's voice broke through his thoughts. She stood behind him, her arms wrapped around herself against the chill. "Just thinking," he replied, gesturing to the log beside him. She sat, close enough that he could smell the faint scent of lavender. "You don't strike me as someone who believes in rituals," she said, tilting her head to study him. Tom shrugged. "I guess I've always been more practical." "That's a shame," she said, her tone teasing. "Sometimes rituals are what connect us to something bigger than ourselves. They remind us we're not alone." Her words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. Tom felt a flicker of something, curiosity, or maybe temptation. He dismissed it, chalking it up to exhaustion. The next day passed in a blur of hiking and casual conversation. Tom avoided Sophia as much as possible, though she seemed to find reasons to be near him. At lunch, she sat beside him, brushing his arm lightly as she passed him a plate. During the afternoon hike, she walked just ahead, occasionally glancing back with a sly smile. By evening, Tom's unease had grown. He couldn't tell if Sophia was intentionally toying with him or if he was reading too much into her actions. The campfire crackled to life again as the group gathered for dinner. Laughter and conversation filled the clearing, but Tom felt distant from it all. Sophia began another story, this one about a remote tribe that believed in celestial unions, rituals performed to align human energy with the cosmos. "They say it brings clarity," she explained, her voice hushed as if sharing a secret. "A chance to leave behind everything holding you back and become something more." Tom caught her gaze and quickly looked away. He could feel his pulse quicken, though he didn't understand why. As the night deepened, the group began to dwindle. One by one, they retired to their tents until only Tom and Sophia remained. She leaned closer to the fire, her face illuminated by its glow. "You seem restless," she said, her voice soft. Tom hesitated. "Just tired?" Sophia smiled knowingly. "Sometimes we carry things we don't even realize. Fears, regrets, They weigh us down. Her words cut deeper than they should have. Tom stood abruptly, brushing ash from his jeans. I should get some sleep? Of course, she said, her tone light. But as he turned to leave, she added, if you change your mind, let me know. I can show you something that might help. Tom didn't respond. He slipped into his tent, zipping it shut with more force than necessary. The air inside was stuffy, and his sleeping bag felt like a trap. He lay staring at the nylon ceiling, Sophia's words echoing in his mind. The forest was silent again, save for the rustling of leaves in the breeze. Tom shifted restlessly, unable to shake the sense that something was about to happen. He closed his eyes, forcing his mind to quiet. Outside, the campfire had long since burned out. Darkness enveloped the campsite, thick and impenetrable. In the stillness, a faint sound reached Tom's ears, the soft crunch of footsteps on dirt. He froze, his breath caught in his throat. The sound grew louder, closer, until it stopped just outside his tent. A moment later, the zipper began to slide down, slow and deliberate. Tom's heart pounded. "Who's there?" he whispered, though he already knew the answer. The flap opened, and Sophia crawled inside. She moved with a strange confidence, her silhouette barely visible in the dim light. She wore nothing, her bare skin glowing faintly in the darkness. "It's just me," she said, her voice low and steady. "Don't be afraid. What are you doing?" Tom's voice was a hoarse whisper, a mix of shock and confusion. She smiled, her expression enigmatic. "This is the ritual I told you about. To let go. To find clarity." Tom's mind raced, every instinct screaming at him to stop this before it began. But as she leaned closer, her breath warm against his skin, he felt his resolve falter. The forest outside remained silent, indifferent to the choices unfolding within the small tent. The air inside the tent felt stifling, heavy with unspoken tension. Tom's heart pounded in his chest, his mind torn between disbelief and the magnetic pull of the moment. Sophia knelt before him, her silhouette soft yet commanding, a contradiction that mirrored the turmoil within him. Her bare skin caught the faint light filtering through the nylon, her presence both surreal and undeniable. "This isn't right," Tom said, his voice cracking under the weight of his words. Sophia tilted her head, her expression calm, yet unervingly intense. "Who decides what's right?" she asked, her tone low and measured. "Sometimes the universe brings us moments we can't explain, moments we're meant to embrace." Her words felt rehearsed, almost scripted, but they carried a weight that sank deep into Tom's already fragile psyche. He looked away, his eyes fixating on the faint outlines of his belongings strewn across the tent floor. "I have a wife," he murmured, the statement sounding more like a plea than a declaration. "I know," Sophia said simply, her voice devoid of judgment. She moved closer, her knees brushing against his. "But when was the last time you felt seen? Truly seen?" The question sliced through him like a blade. It was the very thing he had been avoiding for months, maybe years. His marriage to Claire had devolved into a series of polite exchanges and distant silences, their connection buried beneath the weight of routine and unspoken resentments. Sophia's gaze held him captive, her eyes reflecting something he hadn't felt in a long time: desire, or maybe understanding. Tom's breath came in shallow gasps as Sophia reached out, her fingers lightly tracing the edge of his arm. The touch was electric, a stark contrast to the cold detachment he had grown accustomed to. He flinched, but didn't pull away. "This isn't about betrayal," Sophia whispered. "It's about finding yourself, letting go of the barriers that keep you caged." Her words blurred the lines between seduction and philosophy, but Tom felt their impact all the same. A part of him wanted to push her away, to zip the tent closed and pretend this had never happened. Yet another part, buried deep beneath layers of guilt and responsibility, ached to give in. "You make it sound so easy," he said, his voice barely audible. "It's not." Sophia admitted. But it's necessary. She leaned closer, her breath warm against his ear. You don't have to pretend with me, Tom. You don't have to be anyone but yourself. The words hit him like a wave, washing over the defenses he had spent years building. He felt unmoored, untethered from the man he thought he was. Slowly, tentatively, he turned to face her. Their connection unfolded in a way that felt both inevitable and impossible. Tom's hands hovered above her, trembling as if crossing a threshold he could never return from. Sophia guided him gently, her movements deliberate and unhurried. The moment was faceless, a blur of sensations and emotions that defied logic. The soft rustle of the sleeping bag beneath them, the rhythmic pounding of his heart, the heat of her skin, all of it melded into a singular, overpowering experience. Tom's mind teetered on the edge of coherence, bombarded by conflicting thoughts. This isn't who I am. This isn't what I do. And yet, a quieter voice whispered from the shadows. But it's what you want. He tried to silence the voice, but it grew louder with each passing second. Sophia's touch was both grounding and transcendent, pulling him deeper into a reality he couldn't fully comprehend. The climax came like a breaking storm, swift and all-consuming. And then just as suddenly it was over. The tent fell into silence, broken only by their labored breaths. Tom lay still, his body heavy with the weight of what had just transpired. Sophia shifted beside him, her movements languid and unbothered. See, she said, her voice soft but resolute. Doesn't that feel better? Like the universe is finally in alignment? Tom couldn't bring himself to respond. He felt hollow, as if something vital had been stripped from him. Guilt churned in his stomach, clawing its way up to his throat. Sophia sat up, her silhouette outlined by the faint light outside the tent. Don't overthink it, she said, as though sensing his turmoil. This wasn't about them. It was about you. Her words offered little comfort. Tom turned away, staring at the wall of the tent, as if it held the answers he so desperately needed. Minutes passed in heavy silence before Sophia began to dress. She moved with an ease that bordered on indifference, her confidence unshaken. As she reached for the tent zipper, she paused, glancing back at him. Sometimes, the things we fear most are the things we need to face, she said. You'll see. This was just the beginning. And with that, she slipped out into the night, leaving Tom alone with his thoughts. The cold air rushed in briefly before the tent flap fell closed, sealing him in. Tom lay motionless, his mind a chaotic mess of emotions. Regret loomed large, but so did something else, something he couldn't quite name. He replayed Sophia's words over and over, their meaning eluding him, yet clinging to him all the same. Outside, the forest remained eerily silent, as if bearing witness to his unraveling. He stared at the ceiling of the tent, his pulse finally beginning to slow. And then, like a faint whisper carried on the wind, a new thought crept into his mind. What now? The question lingered, unanswered, as the night stretched on, its darkness deeper than ever before. The first light of dawn seeped through the fabric of Tom's tent, casting faint golden streaks across his face. He lay awake, unmoving, the events of the night replaying in his mind like a relentless film. Regret clung to him, heavy and suffocating, as if the tent's walls were closing in. Outside, the campsite stirred with the sound of rustling sleeping bags and murmured conversations, but Tom stayed hidden, unsure how to face the world beyond the nylon barrier. The flap of his tent rustled suddenly, and a voice broke through the stillness. Hey, Tom, breakfast is ready. It was Eric, his co-worker and the orchestrator of the weekend trip. Yeah, I'll be there in a minute, Tom called back, his voice strained. When the campsite fell quiet again, he finally sat up. His limbs felt leaden as he pulled on his jacket, his thoughts a tangled web of guilt and confusion. Sophia's words from the night before echoed in his ears. This wasn't about them. It was about you. The smell of coffee and sizzling bacon greeted him as he stepped into the clearing. The others were clustered around the fire, their laughter and easy camaraderie starkly contrasting Tom's inner turmoil. He avoided eye contact, his gaze darting to Sophia, who was seated at the far end of the group. She appeared unbothered, her expression calm, her movements unhurried. If she felt any guilt or shame, she didn't show it. "Morning, Tom," Eric said, handing him a plate. "Sleep well?" "Yeah," Tom lied, forcing a weak smile. Sophia caught his eye then, holding his gaze for a moment longer than necessary. There was no trace of remorse in her expression, only a quiet certainty that unnerved him. He looked away quickly, his appetite vanishing despite the plate of food in his hands. As the group packed up their gear, Tom found himself growing increasingly paranoid. He couldn't shake the feeling that someone had noticed something the night before, a lingering glance, a faint rustle outside the tent. Every casual remark or passing look felt like an accusation, though no one said anything out of the ordinary. Sophia, however, seemed entirely at ease. She hummed softly as she rolled up her sleeping bag, occasionally glancing in his direction with a subtle smile. It was as if she thrived on his discomfort, feeding off his unease. At one point, she approached him under the guise of needing help with her tent. "You're overthinking everything," she whispered, her voice low enough that no one else could hear. "I don't know what you're talking about," Tom replied tersely, his hands fumbling with the tent pole. Sophia chuckled, a sound that was both amused and condescending. "You'll see," she said cryptically. "The truth always reveals itself, one way or another." The drive home was suffocating. Tom shared a car with Eric and another coworker, the three of them exchanging polite small talk as the forest blurred into endless miles of asphalt. But no matter how much distance he put between himself and the campsite, the weight of what had happened refused to lift. Halfway through the journey, his phone buzzed. It was a message from Claire, his wife. "Can't wait to see you tonight. I miss you." Tom stared at the words, his chest tightening. He thought of her waiting at home, completely unaware of the betrayal that now hung between them like a storm cloud. He typed a quick response, "Me too," before shoving the phone back into his pocket. By the time Tom arrived home, dusk had begun to settle. Claire greeted him at the door, her smile warm but tinged with curiosity. "How was the trip?" she asked, leaning in to kiss him. "It was fine," he said, the lie tasting bitter on his tongue. She took his bag, setting it down by the stairs. "You look tired. Long drive?" "Yeah, something like that." Claire didn't press further, and Tom felt both relieved and guilty for her trust. As the evening wore on, they fell back into their usual routine. Dinner, a shared bottle of wine, a movie on the couch. But Tom couldn't shake the feeling that everything was somehow different. The guilt gnawed at him, sharper with each passing hour. That night, as Claire slept beside him, Tom lay awake staring at the ceiling. His thoughts were a cacophony of regret, anger, and confusion. He wanted to blame Sophia, to convince himself that she had manipulated him, but he knew the truth. He had made a choice that now threatened to unravel everything he had built. Suddenly, Claire stirred, her hand brushing against his arm. "You okay?" she murmured sleepily. "Yeah," he whispered, his voice hollow. "Just couldn't sleep." She mumbled something unintelligible and drifted back to sleep, her breathing steady and peaceful. Tom closed his eyes, the weight of his actions pressing down on him like a physical force. Weeks passed, and life returned to a semblance of normalcy. Tom threw himself into work, avoiding any thoughts of the camping trip or what had happened that night. Sophia, meanwhile, remained an enigma. She didn't contact him, didn't show any sign that their encounter had meant anything at all. But the memory lingered, a shadow he couldn't escape. Every time Claire laughed, every time she reached for his hand, Tom felt the weight of his betrayal anew. He tried to convince himself that it had been a mistake, a moment of weakness, but the guilt refused to fade. One evening, As they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Claire turned to him. "You've been quiet lately," she said, her tone gentle. Tom hesitated, his stomach twisting into knots. "Just tired," he said, forcing a smile. Claire studied him for a moment, her brow furrowing slightly. "If something's bothering you, you can tell me, you know." The words hung between them, heavy with unspoken truths. Tom opened his mouth to respond, but found himself unable to speak. Instead, he nodded, muttering a quiet, "I know." Later that night, as Tom stood in the backyard staring up at the stars, he thought of Sophia's parting words. This was just the beginning. He didn't know what she had meant, but the uncertainty gnawed at him. Was it a warning? A promise? Or simply another layer of her enigmatic manipulation? The stars above were indifferent, their light cold and distant. Tom took a deep breath, his gaze fixed on the vast expanse of the universe. For a moment, he felt impossibly small, a man adrift in a sea of his own mistakes. And then he turned and walked back inside, closing the door behind him.